Hey folks, Sylvia's here with another FDR. Got my little new logo screen for FDR. We're here in the Anchorman Desert. That's the oasis up there. We're here to go kill larvae. And talk about trickle-down economics. So, now before I actually get into trickle-down economics, there's actually a couple things I'm doing in this video. But the first thing I actually need to do is kind of point out that trickle-down economics is not actually the correct term for what we're talking about. Trickle-down economics itself is actually more of a derogatory term used by people to criticize the economic policy of which it's actually about. It's kind of like how people called Obamacare, where it's actually called the Affordable Care Act kind of situation. Look at that, leveled up. Trickle-down economics, though, is the term that's most commonly known in the United States, and even people who support the idea of trickle-down economics often refer to it by that name. So that's why I'm using it in this. Also because I'm not a big fan of it, so I'm going to insult it. So yeah, that's how that works. So I just figured I should mention that. What trickle-down economics is actually referring to is a broad series of economic policies that are generally fall underneath the name category of supply-side economics. In simplest terms, the general idea is that the economy grows and the market grows best when you keep your hands off it and just let it do its thing. More wealth will be generated with less intervention from outside sources, to a certain extent. That's a gross oversimplification of it. Now, so we do need to talk about this, though. So before I kind of get into it, I want to actually explain, though, what trickle-down economics and what supply-side economics are. Again, those two terms are interchangeable, and I'm going to continue probably using trickle-down. So the general idea here is that... and there's various reasons for this, and various justifications given. But the general idea is that when you reduce the tax rate on the upper levels of the economy, and by that I mean the ultra wealthy and corporations and entities that make massive amounts of money. The idea is that those entities are the big movers in the economics world. So, if you lower the tax rate, and generally speaking you also lower the regulations on those entities, they will thus make more money, and then more money will flow through the economy, and then overall we have a better situation. Now, before I go into further detail, I need to explain this concept that the economy actually does, in fact, is healthier, I should say, when money is flowing through it. So the economy is based off of flow of wealth. And if the wealth is not flowing, even if there's a large amount of wealth, if the wealth is being stored and saved, for instance, and hoarded, that's not good for the economy. The economy is better when banks lend, people are buying. So, the bank lends you money, you buy a house, so you get a mortgage. You now have a house, so, the carpenters, the plumbers, the guy putting the windows in, the painters, the shinglers, all the people that work on the house are getting paid to build this house. Then you buy furniture, you buy appliances, you buy, dishes and whatnot. You buy things for this house. And then you also pay, monthly maintenance for this house, which is, property taxes, electricity, water, plumbing, oil, whatever it is that you use, You're paying for these services in this house that you have. And now all the people that you have paid those things to, the electric company, the oil company, whoever made your furniture, whoever sold you the furniture, because they're not usually the same people. You're usually not buying your furniture directly from the dude who made it, or the factory that made it. You're probably buying it from IKEA is, I guess, a bad example, I think, because they kind of make their own furniture. But the reseller, in other words, is, making money. And then in turn, these companies are paying their employees. This sort of sucks. There we go. They're paying their employees. So, money is flowing through the market. The employees can then go purchase things and it keeps moving. When people just stick their money into, the shoebox under the bed or things like that, that's not actually healthy for the economy because the money's not flowing. Part of the reason, and as an example of this, I should say, is why the United States currently has a prime interest rate of 0 or very close to 0, because they want to promote lending and borrowing. They want people to go, well, interest rates will be shockingly incredibly low, so now's a good time for me to, get a new car or something, because they want the money to keep flowing. So now going back to supply side economics or trickle-down economics, the idea is that by letting the upper tier of the wealth group make extra money, that they will then, the idea then is that it trickles down essentially. So your big businesses and your ultra wealthy will have more money, which they can invest in expanding their businesses. So you as an individual, you can buy a new house, but you don't do that very often. But, that's kind of the biggest expenditure you can make, buying a new house. Whereas, Ford Motor Company can buy a new factory and hire, another 6,000 people or something like that. So that's the idea then, is that the big people, the big players, can then mobilize more money into the economy. And then it'll trickle down to the other people. So Megabucks Corporation gets a tax cut. So now they can expand their businesses. So they open up new plants. They expand into new markets. They hire new people. And then more money flows through the market in that sense. So that's basically trickle-down economics in a nutshell. Now, I need to explain why it doesn't necessarily work. Now, the first thing, though, I need to say is that there is in theory and in practice kind of dichotomy we have here. Some ideas, in theory, are good ideas, but in practice they don't work. A classic example of that would be communism, actually. Because in theory, the ideas behind communism aren't, necessarily 100% invalid. Obviously, we can argue about, the inherent, pros and cons of communism, but the general idea is that communism as a theory isn't just, inherently wrong. And it's not capitalism and democracy have no issues with them either. Otherwise, we wouldn't be talking about trickle-down economics. The problem, though, with communism, though, is that while in theory it was an acceptable idea, in practice it didn't work right. So what that generally means is that, the process of inputting it from idea into actuality runs into hiccups. Now, there's a difference between it just didn't work and it was inherently flawed or we couldn't put it forth. So, if you're looking at a gamble, for instance, where there's a 90% chance you win, so you invest all of your wealth into that and then lose. That wasn't an example of it not working in practice, because that did work in practice. You did, in fact, have a 10% chance of losing. That was just you having bad luck. But, so that's the idea, I guess, of in practice versus in theory. So in theory, it's the idea it's the idea, and then in practice is the real-world application of it. So, and that's important because, like I said, with the communism thing, you actually have that issue where communism in theory wasn't, inherently wrong, but in practice, it has issues. So we have the same problem with trickle-down economics. So first, though, I want to kind of hit on the in-theory problems with trickle-down economics. And then we'll talk about the in-practice ones. Now, the in-theory ones are debatable. Because we don't actually have a, this has happened, perfect, implementation of the theory of trickle-down economics, we can't say for certain whether or not it works. A close example, though, right now, is the state of Kansas, who has elected, twice in a row, actually, a, hyper-conservative Tea Party Republican as governor, and he has implemented, stringent supply-side economic policies, in addition with other things. And the end result of that is that Kansas is like the worst state in the United States in every kind of like economic metric imaginable. Like, complete and utter failure. And that's why Dorothy left Kansas and went to the Wizard of Oz's land. But anyway. But yeah, we don't actually have a, like, perfect model, because, like, there are other things happening in Kansas, and it's not like that Republican governor only implemented supply-side economics. He also implemented a whole bunch of other conservative policies of, you know, like, hating gay people and, you know, hating minorities and things like that. Which, you know, is causing its own other slew of issues. But, like, in theory, the supply-side economics thing is only reducing upper-level tax rates. The Kansas also did a couple of other things. That's a lot of meat up there. Which has caused issues. But anyway. So, like, we don't have a perfect model to say whether or not supply-side economics works. And granted, like, yay, meat. Yeah, and like I said, and granted, the theory behind supply-side economics, trickle-down economics, isn't something that I can definitively say is wrong. Everything kind of has its pros and cons, and this most assuredly does also. So it's not something I can just be like, well, this is why it's wrong. I'm still not a big fan of it, for various reasons, and we'll talk about them. So, and then after that, I'll talk about why it doesn't work in practice, which is the more important part. But yeah, so like the theory then of supply-side economics, trickle-down economics, is that by reducing the tax rate on the top, that will allow them to expand their businesses more and hire more people. The problem with this is a lot of research and like economic modeling kind of indicates that the wealthier are more likely to save. This makes sense when you think about it, because it's the wealthy that like hand down massive sized inheritances to their children. They save that money. It also makes sense when you think about it logically, because there's a maximum amount of money I can like reliably spend in a certain amount of time. Like, you know, I can sit down on Amazon right now and go, well, here's a whole bunch of things that I kind of need or want, and spend, you know, like $5,000 pretty easily. I could get a new computer, I could get, like, you know, a whole bunch of new things. If I suddenly hit the lottery and was willing to just blow all of that money as fast as humanly possible, like, I could do it, because I'm currently not really having the best of everything. But when you're ultra wealthy, you've already got an awesome car, or several. You've already got an awesome house, or several. You've already got, like, awesome things and stuff like that. So when we're talking, like, millions of dollars, billions of dollars even, that some of these people have, they can't really, like, effectively spend all of that. So, like, a 100% increase to my money right now would be huge for me, and I could spend that in minutes. A 100% increase in, like, you know, Bill Gates' total wealth or something like that, he might not even be able to spend that in his lifetime if he goes all out in trying to spend it. Assuming he's not giving the money away to other people. So, I mean, it does make sense. But yeah, so that's the thing, is that when I said earlier, what's good for the economy is money flowing, not money being stored. And the wealthy people generally tend to save and store more money. Whether or not that's in just bank accounts, whether or not that's in mutual funds or stock options or commodities or, you know, like gold and other precious materials and stuff like that. That's generally not the best thing for the economy. Still, though, it does make sense, though, that lowering the tax rate on the ultra-wealthy would boost the economy to a certain extent. The other thing, though, is that the main premise behind the trickle-down economic theory is that when you lower the tax rate on the wealthy, whatever you lower it by, enough additional wealth will form through the trickle-down effect that whatever the tax rate was, through increased productivity, the government would make that back up. So, like, let's just say, hypothetically, I'm going to throw out some just random numbers. The tax rate is at 50%, and that means the government takes in $1 million. The idea is that if they lower the tax rate to 25%, more people will make more money so that they'll still take in $1 million, even though it's at a lower tax rate. Because otherwise, you're just running a deficit. And the idea, generally speaking, is that you don't want to run a deficit. That running a deficit isn't really a good thing. Running some level of deficit sometimes isn't necessarily, like, the worst thing in the world. That's why, like, businesses and everything use credit to expand their businesses and stuff like that. Because, like, building your new super factory on credit and knowing you're going to pay it off is actually a better economic choice than waiting until you have the money to build your super factory. Because if you, build the super factory on credit, you can start making additional income from it while paying off the, the relatively low interest rates. God, I got like something stuck in my throat. It sucks. I'm also running a little bit low on mana. So yeah, like that's just kind of how that rolls. But yeah, so like that's one of the issues with it, and because that happens, there's not necessarily the situation where the additional wealth is generated doesn't always happen. God. I'm actually going to pause once I kill these things and go get something to drink. Come on, just die already. I'm about to run out of mana, too. Actually, this is a great time for me to pause, because it'll give me some time to regen some mana. Alright, let me pause this recording real quick and go get something to drink. Let me tell you something funny, right? I get up to go get my drink. It's in my refrigerator. I open up my refrigerator, it's not there. I'm like, did I finish this last night? I go all the way downstairs, get another one, bring it up, stick it in my refrigerator after I take a drink, walk back to my computer. My drink's just sitting there right next to me on my computer desk. I forgot that I brought it over. Anyway, moving on. The other sort of issue with the supply side economics is that it does not help all parties equally. Ideally, you'd either be balanced. So, like, everybody gets, a fair share of help in the form of whatever your economic policy is. Or you would do it by, like, need. So you would go, like, okay, well, like, poor people need help more. So let me come up with an economic policy that helps poor people more. Or you would just go, this policy helps everybody equally. Okay? That's, like, the only, reasonable way to do it. Trickle-down economics, though, massively gives more benefit to the upper people. Whether or not it actually works and the effects actually trickle down to the lower people, which is debatable, but whether or not it actually works, even if it does work like the theory says it's supposed to, it still helps the ultra-wealthy way more. Because, think about the term, trickle-down economics. What you're getting as a middle class or as a, impoverished person is the trickle down. So, like, a huge bucket of water is poured onto this building, and then, some of it trickles down the sides. That's what you're getting. So the people on top are getting this flood of water or this flood of wealth, and the people at the bottom are getting what's left over and trickling down on them. And that is basically what happens. So, Megabucks Corporation gets this huge tax cut, which allows them to massively expand their operations into, like, a new region or a new country or something like that, or, lets them just create a new product line. So they start making huge amounts more money, and then all of its employees get to see, like, an extra $50 a week or something. Meanwhile, though, the CEO of Megabucks Corporation is like, sweet, now I can buy 2 airplanes. So, that's the bigger issue, I think, with the theory behind trickle-down economics, is that it's almost as if the benefits to the lower end are like a side effect. Like, somebody sat down and was like, let me think of an economic policy that massively helps wealthy people. And then they came up with a whole bunch of ideas, and then they looked at one of them and went like, oh, this supply-side economics is pretty cool. It also has some tangible benefits for the lower classes, which is cool because, otherwise they would never allow us to implement this idea. Now, it's also worth mentioning, before I go into the problems with the theory, or with the practice of trickle-down, I kind of want to go off on a little tangent. A while back I did a video where I was kind of saying like the problems facing the Republican Party. And in that I was kind of mentioning how the Republican Party is made up of an alliance of like three kind of separate groups. And those separate groups are big business interests, your like average everyday dude who's a social conservative, and also kind of the defense hawk group. And the defense hawk group would be people that are like, strong in military matters and stuff like that. And these three groups are not necessarily like inherently aligned with each other. They made an alliance out of like convenience. If you think about it, like the big business groups are looking to make additional money for themselves. The defense hawks want strong national security and stuff like that, and the social conservatives just want, socially conservative things to happen. There's only overlap as much as a person falls into two of the separate categories. Like, if you're a defense contractor, then you're going to be one of the defense hawks, and you're also going to care about the, the effects of big business because you're a defense contractor. If you're socially conservative but also serve in the military or something like that, you're going to care about, defense hawk stuff plus socially conservative stuff. And actually, in that same video, I kind of talked about a lot of the problems facing the Republican Party is in the form that these these three groups aren't all being adequately addressed by the Republican Party, and you see that where the big business things kind of get pushed more than the socially conservative things. And as an example, I also recently did a video on abortion. I can guarantee you that your huge businesses don't care about abortion. Unless they're also religious businesses. But Microsoft, Apple, those are actually probably bad examples because I think they're more liberal-leaning companies. But even your defense contractors, Lockheed Martin, they don't care if people are getting abortions. They really don't. In fact, from a purely cost-benefit analysis, abortions are probably positives for big businesses because that means women don't have to go on maternity leave and then have reduced work schedules while, taking care of their children. They can just go oh, I don't want this pregnancy, and then go and abort it. So that's more time that they can work. But we have that issue where the groups don't really necessarily align, and you see that with the trickle-down things. The trickle-down economic policy is clearly a policy designed to help the big businesses. The trickle-down aspect is added in as an afterthought, as a way to sell the idea to the other group, mostly the social conservative group. So they're oh yeah, this will also help you, kind of, and maybe we can figure out a way to explain it so that, when it trickles down, people will have less abortions and stuff, maybe. So, that's kind of how that works. Alright, so that's the problems with the theory of trickle-down. Now let's talk about the problems with the practice of the trickle-down. And this is the important part. This is why trickle-down economics will never, ever work in American politics. Because, again, like I said, the theory, legitimately might be sound in that it works as it's advertised. Even if it works as advertised, it's still going to affect the ultra-wealthy way more than it will affect other groups. That goes without saying. That's just how that's happening. But in practice, though, it's never going to work. The biggest reason why in practice it's never going to work is, let's do a hypothetical. Now, by the way, this is 5 days before the election, just in case anybody's watching this in the future. In 5 days, the election happens, and Donald Trump goes up against Hillary Clinton. Let's say Donald Trump wins. Okay? I'm not saying anything about this, so let's just say he wins. Let's say he wins by a crushing landslide. 400 of the Electoral College vote, 90% of the popular vote. He crushes into a, unprecedented landslide victory. Meanwhile, Republicans dominate in the House, and they dominate in the Senate, too. And then, let's just say in this, following this hypothetical situation, that all the Democrat senators and all the Democrat congressmen are like, okay, we need to readjust and come up with a new strategy, and, we need to figure out what we're doing here. So they all go to Hawaii to have, a super conference, and while they're there, the volcano erupts and they all die. Okay? So there are no Democrats in Congress or Senate at all. So with this complete 100% majority that Donald Trump has, he nominates he elects and gets nominated his Supreme Court justices. And let's add on, the Democrat-leaning Supreme Court justices went to Hawaii too, and they also died in the volcano explosion. So Donald Trump implements his supply-side policies. Does it full on, he says, all right, the upper 10% of wealth holders, they pay 0% tax on anything. They pay no sales tax, they pay no business tax, they pay no capital gains tax, there's no estate tax, there's nothing. No tax at all. The first problem, of course, at this point is going to be that even if this works, it takes time. So when the taxes get lowered, it's like an investment in the future kind of thing. So you're like, all right, I'm going to lower taxes, and that means we're going to be making less money for a while until the effects that we're expecting come around. This could be 5 years, this could be 6 years, this could be a while. Because, those factories and those expansions actually take a while to get into effect. But, okay, so that's the first problem. But here's the real problem. So Donald Trump implements all these ideas. And he does it shockingly incredibly fast, but it still takes him a year to do all of these things. And that's shockingly incredibly fast with a situation where there are no Democrats in high-ranking governmental positions to thwart this at all. So, before the effects actually take place, though, we're going to be running at, massive deficits. That's the first problem. But the second problem is that, alright, so it takes Donald Trump a year to implement these policies. And then, from that point on, it's 3 years away until he's up for re-election. Now, most of the time, the sitting president gets re-elected. So, in a sense, it's 7 years until he's not in office anymore. And who knows what the other president's going to do. Even if it's another Republican president, is he going to go as far as Donald Trump went with the 0% all taxes on the wealthy? It's hard to say. Now, businesses need to, answer to their shareholders and stuff like that. Even if they're private businesses, they kind of need to answer to their, family members and things like that, and their own, economic needs. So, imagine, though, if you're a big business, right, and you're turning a profit, and then a situation comes up where they're like, okay, a tax decrease. Now, to simplify this, instead of let's thinking of a tax decrease, let's just say that every year a pile of money is handed to them. So instead of thinking it like a pile of money that would be taken away from them is instead held on, they get to keep it, just think of it like, every year they get just a windfall of money. Would you take that windfall of money and invest it in something massive, knowing that you might stop getting that windfall in 3 or 7 years? That's really questionable, because if you expand expecting that windfall to function as your source of your expansion, and then that windfall goes away, you have a huge problem. And, a business would have already expanded if they could afford the expansion just by themselves. Ford Motor Company either has no need to expand or can't afford it at the moment. That's what I'm saying. A business doesn't just go, nah, we don't need to make more money. We're good with the little bit we have. That's not how businesses work. So Megabucks company wants to hire new people and open up a new plant and expand to a new like country or region, but they can't because either it makes no like it's not something that they want to do in the first place, which or they can't afford it. So if you go, well, we're giving you this windfall every every year for the next 3 to 7 years, that might allow them to afford it, but they're not going to be able to afford it long term. So if that windfall goes away at some point, they're not going to be able to sustain their expansion, and then they're going to have a huge problem. And that's sort of the problem, is that the political situation goes crazy every 4 to 8 years in America. We went from George Bush, who was also doing supply-side economics, and, he had the Bush-era massive tax cuts. Now, it's hard to say whether or not the Bush-era massive tax cuts would have worked or have done anything, because the idea of the Bush-era tax cuts were not planning on there being 2 wars in the middle of that. That was an unintended thing that kind of popped up and threw a wrench into things. To be fair to George Bush, airplanes crashing into buildings are not something you can anticipate. You don't just schedule that happening. Like, oh, by the way, on Thursday we're going to have massive terrorist attacks that wildly alter our society and our economy. That's not something you can just, plan for. Looted an Armenian mace. Boom. But yeah, so you can't really say whether or not the Bush tax cuts work. Now, the Bush tax cuts did leave us into a huge deficit and also put us into, a pretty big, debt level. But how much of that was the aftermath of the war and so on. But you do also have to understand that before George Bush, it was Bill Clinton. And Bill Clinton's government was running a surplus for most of the years. So while there was still a national debt, which, there pretty much always is, Bill Clinton was actually working to get rid of that national debt. Bill Clinton was making the government run on a surplus, which is something that happens pretty rarely. And then the Bush-era tax cuts immediately killed that. And then before I'm not going to stay up on the next floor. Before we could even see if the Bush-era tax cuts were going to do anything, the war has happened. But consider, though, you had relatively liberal Clinton, who was running a surplus. Then all of a sudden you have George Bush, who's pushing for huge tax cuts on the wealthy. And then after that, all of a sudden you have Obama, who's doing the exact opposite. You don't make huge investment decisions based off of what the government is doing in America, because it changes too often, and it changes based off of too many things that can't really be, accounted for. And that's, the biggest reason why the supply-side economics won't work in America, because we have that. Now, if Donald Trump got elected and then somehow was able to declare himself dictator for life, then then maybe we could see whether or not they would work. Did I already go down here? I don't think I did. But somebody did. Huh. So, that's the main reason why they won't work. Besides the fact that, the theory itself might actually be flawed, and also the fact that the theory definitely provides more assistance to the ultra-wealthy as opposed to your middle and lower-class people. But, yeah, so, like I said, that's basically where the whole theory falls apart at that point. There are, other problems with it, too. Again, generally the fact that it doesn't work. Like I said, I'm not a big fan of the supply-side economics theory. The issue I find with it is that, this is now just kind of my personal opinions at this point. The issue I find with it is that it's like a gamble. You do this first, and it causes a short-term loss, and if it works the way it's expected to, you end up getting a long-term gain. But if it doesn't work the way you expect it to, you get the short-term loss and nothing. You just take a loss. I mean, like, I understand that, like, you sometimes have to, like, gamble and invest in things like that. But it seems questionable to invest in a theory that might not work, that comes with an upfront huge cost, that will most likely not work in America, and that will also benefit one group, like, disproportionately to the others. And also, it's going to benefit the group that needs it the least likely, or the least amount, I should say. Like, the middle class and the lower class and, the other groups of society, they're the ones that need help. The people that have 6 mansions, yachts, personal airplanes, like, Donald Trump, for all of his flaws and whatever, he does not need additional, like, financial help from the government. Like, people like him do not need additional help making their ends meet. Donald Trump flies everywhere in his own personal plane. Buys, companies and slaps his name all over it for the sake of... I mean, I don't really want to insult him in this particular video, but, like, like Trump steaks, Trump vodka, Trump planes, Trump towers. Like, do you know how many buildings or products that you can buy have Silvius's name on them? None. Like, I don't need additional help, or I need additional help. My parents need additional help with things. Like, my family needs additional help with things. Warren Buffett, Donald Trump, Bill Gates, Tim Cook? I think it's Tim Cook. The Apple guy. I can't remember the dude that came up with Facebook. But those people don't need help. They're already got their massive amounts of wealth. They don't need additional things. Now, I'm not, like, necessarily advocating for some kind of, like, socialist redistribute the wealth system, and I'm not advocating for, like, a huge expansion in the welfare system or something along those lines. But, I mean, like, think about who legitimately needs help. And, I mean, like, it also, to me, it makes more sense that, like, if you make education cheaply available so that, more people are educated and then can do more useful things, that seems like an effective way, to me, to get the economy moving better. Having more skilled workers so that more people can actually spend decent amounts of money seems like a better way to do things, as opposed to making it so that the giant super businesses can maybe hire more people. And of course, the other issue, too, with that is that it's not like the giant super businesses get to, like, they don't have oversight where, like, an outside entity decides what the CEO gets paid and what the employees get paid. The CEO gets to decide what he gets paid and what the employees get paid. So if the CEO wants to be like, oh, yeah, now that we've got these huge tax cuts that are increasing our revenue, I'm going to increase my salary by 50%, and, I'll raise the wages of all of my employees by, like, 0.2%. Which is what we basically see happening all the time, which is why, like, during the Bush era, like, CEO and, like, corporate executive pay skyrocketed, and we saw a huge widening of the wealth gap. Because George Bush did use supply-side economics, and the end result of his supply-side economics were that the financial crisis happened, for one, and then for two, that, wealthy people got massively more wealthy, and poor people kind of got poorer, and middle-class people got a little bit poorer also, actually. And then, the financial crisis happened and screwed up everybody's life. And even now that we're coming out of the financial crisis, generally speaking, the middle and low classes are still struggling massively, but, like, the stock market and the higher class folks are doing perfectly fine at this point. So anyway, that's trickle-down economics, people. As always, you know what? I gotta do this, actually. As always, like, favorite, comment, subscribe, check me out on Patreon, Twitter, Facebook, and I will see you folks later.